So I have the honor to chair, good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor to chair or moderate this session. I'm showing the type of role that I expect to have by my physical disassociation from our speakers, who will be providing the input of the day. First, to announce, unfortunately, that Kriti is unable to join us, so it will be the three of us, and we'll have the order, Shiv will be speaking third, so that we've changed the order of the presentations. I confine myself to saying three things. First, that I come to this question or this issue through my work on the international criminal justice system, both in the International Law Commission, which eventually led to the creation of the International Criminal Court. Now, when that process was going on, of course, there were the models that we will be discussing this morning, or this afternoon. And the question arose, what would be the relationship between a formal international criminal court and these bodies? And include the more general question of amnesties, when amnesties are offered to, for reasons differing from country to country. My commission, and followed by the drafters of the statute of the International Criminal Court, chose not to deal with this directly. But there is a way that the mechanism is incorporated through a possibility to continue with the case when it, quote, does not serve the interests of justice, which could be a kind of a buzzword for allowing this type of process to continue. My second point of three is that I also come to this with the experience of having served as the ambassador of my country, I'm from Iceland, to South Africa, which we know is the Fons et Origo of one of the major truth and reconciliation commissions. And I have a lot of personal experience with people that came through that process, both when I was living in Pretoria and then since then, because I served 5 years here as ambassador to India, but also kept my ambassadorships in many other countries, including South Africa. So the people that have been involved that I've come across, including many prominent people, and have heard stories of the kind of reconciliation which has come about. Sometime when we had more time, I can share that with you. But thirdly, my third and final point, by way of introduction, is to continue the discussion we had just now about the prospects of this type of a system, an alternative system, ever coming about in India, with all the types of inertia that we have in all types of parts of this country. And I would respond exactly to the way that discussion ended this morning, that yes, we must prepare for that. The people that are sponsoring this type of activity must prepare for that in the hope, not maybe the cynical hope, but the hope that a window will open by the type of leadership that may change sometime. That window will be open only a very short time, and one of the reasons why that might not succeed if it's not fully blown is that shall we say, the powers that be, the powers that just like to delay things, will start a process of investigation, commissions and so forth. And by the time all that process is finished, then maybe the champion that I mentioned before has already left office, so the opportunity is lost. So having a fully set up system, negotiated through the consultations like this one, is ready, have that ready for the time. And just hopefully that time comes soon, and it will provide some, shall we say, succor and consolation. So having said that, I would call on our speakers to make their contributions, because, of course, one of the expectations of those who are looking at a process which is established will be, how has this been done elsewhere? And that's, of course, we have all these models in various parts of the world. And then also, what is the philosophical groundwork from those other examples, and all our speakers will be discussing that. My final point, which becomes my fourth point, is that one of the distinctive features between what we are doing here and what happened in many other countries is the pan-national element in the other countries. So this is not, unfortunately, what I have to say, it's not a pan-Indian thing like it was a pan-Argentinian thing or a pan-South African thing. it's an isolated, physically isolated problem, which is a problem I know that everyone dealing with this encounters when he comes to Delhi, for instance, or anywhere else in India. So having said those four things, please, which of you would like to continue? Shiv will be speaking last. Shiv is speaking third, so. Okay, please. Oh, good. So let's please. Oh, good, thank you.
Okay, so I wasn't quite sure who was going to be here today, and I have prepared just about five slides with basic points. That when you come to issues of like the ones that we are speaking of today, there is the issue of precedence. What is the precedence which exists for the experience sharing that we are doing and the challenges that we are seeking to deal with and tackle and perhaps have a conversation about? That in so much that there is truth telling, there needs to be truth seeking, then truth listening, because it's okay to have a South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I know from having talked to some of the people who are in that process that the people who were the victims were doubly victimized in many cases, because there was the other person just apologized and got away literally with murder or abuse. And there was compensation, but no true healing, because the harm was done was not really dealt with. So truth-telling, truth-seeking, and truth listening, that you have to listen to what is always on the many other sides. There's not one other side, there are many others. And whether it's Manipur, that Justice Shishak, I'm very glad to see our friends from Manipur, Babdu of course, and his colleague, and the extraordinary work they've done over the years, because we are dealing with extraordinary situation. In all these cases, whether it's South Africa, whether it's in a way Malaysia, which has come out of 60 years of authoritarianism into hopefully a new day of change. Myanmar, which came out, it seemed, out of dictatorship, again of nearly 60 years, 56 years, 54 years, and then falling apart in a manner of speaking. But extraordinary situations demand extraordinary people, not just laws, and very unique, innovative responses. Whether it is Manipur or Assam or Jammu and Kashmir or what existed earlier in the Punjab, you have an extraordinary law in place that defies both logic and any conventional notion of justice. So if we are talking about truth-seeking and truth-telling, precedence, and all of that, and the effort to try and cross boundaries in the realm of justice, are there preconditions to this? In my view, there are. You have to create a precondition. You have to have a precondition that laws which are authoritarian, that prejudice the interests of the citizen, that are inimical to the idea of justice, and totally antithetical, the antithesis of what constitutes democratic practice, need to go. So you can't have transitional justice in a time of acute intimidation and the violence of the state, which is authorized by law, because it just can't happen. The state will not allow it. And I'm talking about the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, to which all of us have connections, all of us have in some way or the other dealt with it. But the clause which is embedded in AFSPA, but also separately in the Disturbed Areas Act, is to declare an area disturbed a part of a state or the. Because I do recall when we did the Armed Forces Special Powers Review, and we gave an opportunity for the mobilization, suddenly the narrative changed and it went to language in Manipur. So often the issues are not driven by the state. Often the non-state also steps in when it feels that some things are perhaps not to its interest. But if we look at just AFSPA, it's these three subsequent points and the sub-points which are embedded in them, which to me are again part of the preconditions. Because whether it's arbitrariness, impunity, immunity, inequality, there is this infection that sets in of the sense of impunity and immunity. And although the law technically covers the army and the paramilitary, central forces, the police also feel imbued and imbibe the sense of immunity, although they're not legally covered. And you have, certainly in the case of Manipur, definitely in the case of other states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, even Delhi and Assam, the police acting above, completely breaking the law, killing people. I mean, we know the case of Hirokjit, who has confessed to 150 in killings? 133 killings. On orders from senior officers. So there's an unquestioning following of orders which emanate from a sense of injustice and impunity. And the fact that in all these acute situations, these unique, difficult situations, there are 4 grades of citizenship which apply, which must be broken if you are to have the kind of conciliatory practices of justice across in a way, time zones. You have the citizen in uniform who is protected by a law. You have the citizen outside of uniform who is not protected by it and is at the mercy of the first. You have a group like this which is completely untouched by any of it, by the law. And you have the fourth, in which the agencies of state assume they have powers which they do not have, which I was referring to earlier, the infection of impunity and immunity, the police. Can you actually handle the past with the present without dealing with the past? And how do we listen? I'll talk very briefly about these 3-4 institutions and examples. I wasn't sure, as I said, how many people would be here, how large the hall was, so I had actually brought a couple of things to read from, but I don't think there's time for that. But I will at the closing. I have to tell you that I have to leave at 1:30 because there's something else I have to go to across the city at 2:30 and be there at 2:30 because I'm chairing that session. We are all familiar with the story of Nelly. I don't know if you're familiar, Ambassador. But in 1983, 35 years ago, and I covered it as a young journalist for the New York Times, 1,753 people were massacred in 6 hours on the paddy fields around about 14 villages. And these were largely children, women, and older men. And they were all Muslim, who spoke Bangla, but who also spoke Assamese. And this was in the heart of Assam, in what is now the district of Morigaon. And they were killed with bows and arrows, machetes, spears, and muskets. Till today, they're still knocking on the doors of the courts seeking compensation. They were paid 3,000 rupees. There were 2 commissions of inquiry which are still classified information. And the people who killed them or attacked them were not outsiders, they were their neighbors. So, whether it's Manipur, which we are focusing on, if there is no sense of justice that communities have, you cannot have an atmosphere that leads to a process of justice. It's not the law, it is the facts which also matter, and the reality. In Arunachal some years ago, I make films as well, documentary films, so we're making a film series on the Brahmaputra television series. And we had gone to Arunachal state and came across this group of, it's called a kebang, it's a public hearing by villagers, a traditional public hearing of a case. It can be any case. In this case, it was a case of a young woman who was murdered by her lover, and she was pregnant at the time. The boy was arrested and taken away and put in jail, but the 2 villagers, because they came from different villages, decided to sit together over several days by the village, by the river, by the Siang. And this is the tradition in that particular tribe, the Adi tribe, that if there is a dispute, the dispute mechanism resolution is a conversation which is over meals, in public spaces, conversations, debate, and drinking. You drink the buckwheat beer. It's very refreshing. It's called apong. And there's a feast at the end of it, all of mithun, which is the wild buffalo. And the conversation went something like this, is that there has been a loss, the boy is taken away, but we have to resolve this among ourselves. He will meet whatever fate he will, but among the families, for resolution, there has to be this conversation and we have to close it. So after 3 days, they came to the following conclusion, that the one family to whom the boy belonged, had to pay their most precious heirlooms, Tibetan necklaces of coral, lapis lazuli, jade, and gold to the family. And the boy, when he came out of jail, or one male member would work on the fields of the afflicted family. So that was regarded as a good resolution. Then there was feasting and drinking. Issue resolved. So what I'm saying is that there are traditions which we do not include in our constitutional legal framework, which are ways of resolving issues quite amicably, without going into too much detail on the legalities. In Ukhrul, Justice Shishak and the others, my other colleagues here will know, we have the Tangkhul, the Supreme Court of the Tangkhuls, and the regional courts, where all issues, apart from, I think, murder, killing, are actually adjudicated and decided upon. And they actually can fine people up to the amount of 1 lakh, if I'm not mistaken. And that amount may have changed since I last attended a hearing. But it seems to me that there has been a complete failure. If you look at the first case, where there was gross violation of rights, mass killings, and we can see across India the spectrum of killings everywhere. The institutions which have exist for justice delivery have completely failed, or significantly, and there is clearly room for both innovation and sharing perhaps some processes from the non-formal systems. And that is what I would urge, that if it's transitional justice, then traditions do need to come into it, because you have to span geographies, cultures, and perhaps even borders. I don't know what happened here. Oh, sorry. I don't want to go into this now because that's a much larger thing, but the second point of healing hurts, binding up the wounds, sharing tragedies, becoming listeners, carrying the burden. Because we have to deal with the fact that PDST and PDSS are major issues and they're not being handled at all. I remember going to make a film in Nagaland some years ago. We called it A Measure of Impunity. It was largely on the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the impact on women in Assam and Nagaland. And we would come back from the shoot and not be able to sleep, because the stories we are hearing were from people who had suffered 40, 50 years ago and had not told anyone, including their own family members. So you become transformed from a documenter and a researcher into a caregiver. You're not equipped for it. How do you do it? And this is, I think, to me, one of the greatest challenges before, whether it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, whichever model you look at for this process, that unless people share their grief as part of truth-telling, and that grief is assuaged to some degree, in some way, we will not be able to deal with it. Because I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and I'm on the board of his counseling and rehab center. And this thing came as a quite surprise to me a few years ago when we were talking at one of our meetings, that 1 in every 10 persons in India has a mental challenge problem of some degree or the other. It may be very minor, virtually non-noticeable, but it could be substantial or it could be extremely significant. That means 1 in 10 out of this room, even, I would dare say, please don't attack me, has possibly mental health issues or challenges. It may be very minor, but so many people may receive compensation, but they don't receive counseling. And you can't heal the violence on the mind with a pay package. I mean, I remember this case of, and I think this was from Nagaland, where the woman was asked about compensation for, she hadn't been raped, but she had been attacked and molested, harmed. She said, "You want me to ask for money from the people who have abused me?" He says, "What do you think that does to me?" So he says, "I'll never ask for any money." So there is this cultural process which we need to understand, which really goes far beyond technicalities. And again, I hope that in the larger discussion we will be able to get into the situation in Assam. But I will just share this, that as Bablu and the others have done in Manipur and others, whether it's on AFSPA, on the encounter and the killings and taking it to court and mobilizing people, the public is not helpless. The public can be mobilized on an issue, and today's Assam, I've just come back from Assam, it's on a knife edge, really on a knife edge. Very tense, very confused, very bitter, but it's mobilized, at least one part of Assam has mobilized against this amendment to the citizenship bill. So the public can come out, the public can confront, and the public can force a change. And the parliamentary committee which is hearing this is not completely divided, and the effort is not to even go into that area, because they see that although there is a party in power there. It is completely divided on this issue. If you give me time, I'm just going to read one little bit, and then I'll close. Because this deals with Nelly. A couple of 100 meters away, a handful of graves of victims of the Nelly frenzy lay silently, located behind a wall. At one edge of the graveyard, men and women worked briskly, drying the paddy they had salvaged from nearby fields. It was as if it was another day of saving their crops, as if nothing had ever happened here. A small marble slab on the graveyard's wall remembers the murders silently. In faded Assamese script, it speaks of the pure sight of the Shaheed, martyrs, giving the date and year of the event, and that the foundation state was laid by two ministers of the Congress government in Assam on 25 February 2011. That's 28 years after the disaster. There's no mention of how many people are slaughtered or why the stone is there, apart from the bloody date. No explanation of why these are Shaheeds, the same word used to describe those who died in the anti-immigration agitation, who have been honored, their families compensated, and legal cases instituted against those who were responsible for their deaths. In the killing fields of Nelly, silence speaks louder than anything else. The families of those butchered received 5,000 rupees at the time, nothing more since. They'll continue to live in a neighborhood of villages among people who are responsible for the violence.
Thank you. I don't know where I put you on the scale of skepticism, but I see from your experience, you also express a hope for the future as you look at alternative ways to address this outside the court system. That seems to be the theme. So, what would you say?